Welcome to the Generic Tech Support YouTube channel, home of the Granite security package. Like and subscribe for more content. Hey guys, so in today's video I want to talk about some things. The first one, which I think is mildly important, is the fact that I am currently working on a Granite 11 package. This is to be kind of an addition to the Granite XP package, but slightly different because at least with Windows 11 you guys have access to all the updates, so there's no reason for me to package that stuff. However, I do want to package all of the NIST configuration standards into a single file that can be used to import into a Windows 11 system to actively control a Windows 11 system. Now, how to do that is much different than, say, Windows 10, which was different than Windows 8.1, which was different than Windows 7, which once again was different than Windows XP. Unfortunately, with Microsoft, every single generation on the client side adds a function or a feature, and they'll call it a security protocol in order to actually add group policy to it. However, the backbone of group policy in the group policy editor on the server, which is what we're looking at here, is designed around Internet Explorer version 7, and it's never been updated. So it still requires Internet Explorer in order to run, which is why on later server operating systems, now this is 2022, but even on 2025, Internet Explorer still exists on those server OSs and is required because Microsoft Edge will not run group policy in the background. Like, you can't view the policy configuration with Microsoft Edge. It has to be Internet Explorer. So it's important that you lock down Internet Explorer protocol and configuration because they haven't updated it, but it's still required to run a lot of the backbone of the actual infrastructure, which becomes a giant security hole or vulnerability on a server when you have Group Policy Configuration Manager installed on it, because once again, you're using a protocol that hasn't been updated to control something on a desktop or a client machine. Now, I know what you're thinking to yourself, which is funny because I was thinking the same thing. If Microsoft knows that this is not secure, why don't they just, out of the box, default configure group policy to block everything that needs to be blocked on Internet Explorer, with the exception of just your group policy management inside of your group policy editor on the server? And quite frankly, I'm wondering the same thing, because they don't. It's out of the box configured to just do whatever. So as a result, it's still a giant security flaw built into all server operating systems that, out of the box, has no security whatsoever configured for it, but also hasn't been updated in a really long time. So why that exists like that is beyond me. Now, on the client side, it gets worse, because what we're looking at here is a Microsoft O365 policy. Now, these policies themselves, the ADMX and ADML templates inside of your domain controller, don't exist out of the box. You actually have to download the templates for these in order to control this stuff. I will tell you right off the bat that the template configuration doesn't work right in Server 2025. Out of the box, there's something bricked with the actual configuration, so good luck on that. I wouldn't run anything Server 2025 for at least a year or two, so Microsoft has some time to figure out and fix all the bugs. Now, this is Server 2022, and I would say this year is the first year that it's actually been reliable. Anything prior to this, there's a lot of buggy issues to the actual 2022 environment, but it took them a couple years, and it did get better eventually, and right now it's pretty good. Server 2019, while I still think that's the best of them, it has a limitation because they revoked the certificate for the server certificate for 2019, and as a result, if you ever have to do a recovery, like a bare metal recovery, using the actual ISO file for 2019, and you're not using a backup solution to do it, in other words, you're doing a file level backup, but you're going to do the ISO install and then thinking you're just going to replicate the data to that ISO, you're not, because if the BIOS have been updated past the 2019 date, you're going to run into an issue without the signed certificate in the actual ISO file, and since Microsoft isn't updating the ISO for 2019 server, you're going to have a real hard time reinstalling the 2019 server OS on your hardware. But with that said, let's talk about this here, which is the Microsoft Office 2016, which is part of the M365 ADMX templates. This is for IE, or Internet Explorer security settings for O365, because once again, Microsoft isn't updating Internet Explorer any longer, so this is like Internet Explorer from Windows 10 when they end-of-lifed it and went to Microsoft Edge, the original Microsoft Edge. So what's happened here is now they have all of these security configuration settings that you have to add to your actual domain controller to lock down Internet Explorer, so that way when your user runs these things, if they get ransomware, it doesn't replicate through the Internet Explorer configuration, because once again, there's no security in IE anymore. So rather than stripping that completely out of the OS, what they've done is they've given engineers and network people hours of additional work that they have to put into an infrastructure configuration in order to lock this stuff down, because it still exists, but it's not patched. In our actual configuration, if you look, we have the IE settings under security settings, and you're going to notice that our configuration has the down arrow. Now, the down arrow inside of a group policy configuration means that's a legacy policy. And the reason why it has to be a legacy policy is because there is no updated policy configuration for Internet Explorer, because once again, it's been end of life for close to probably 5 or 6 years, maybe longer. And as a result, you have legacy policy configuration you have to put in place to actually control this crap to disable it. Again, it's not a dig towards Microsoft per se. I mean, it is, because the reality is that people keep asking me, well, why do you hate Windows? I really don't hate Windows, but I do hate what Microsoft has become, which is lazy. They don't update their code. Everything is a disorganized disaster. There's no script that they follow when they do a build of a new operating system. And I do mean a new operating system. They don't just use the kernel for like the NT kernel and then build off of that without all the garbage in between. They keep adding and adding and adding and adding and adding, and then they disable code, make it dormant, or they set the code to manual where it will just automatically turn on by some hacker that decides that they want to actually trigger it. And as a result, it makes the security on the OS pretty much non-existent. So you end up with an OS that not only reports all your telemetry data to Microsoft for advertising or whatever the heck they're going to use it for, who are going to store it on their more than likely Azure cloud that hackers have already stolen the source code for, and they refuse to disclose what was actually stolen. But then you're also giving them access to parts and pieces and functions of your actual machine, which they know have security flaws, and they refuse to lock them down. And that's why I don't like Microsoft. It's not that I don't like Windows, because Windows does have its place. Windows could be a great operating system. But out of the box, Windows is a mess. And even with all the policy configuration for the Granite 11 package that I'm building here, it really won't make much of a difference as far as the actual OS is concerned. Yeah, the OS will become more secure than it was, but that doesn't mean it is secure. I mean, it's really security by obscurity, because we're obscuring the fact that the OS has a catastrophic design flaw, which is that it still contains dormant code from all the other OSs that, unless you have a domain controller and group policy to really lock down, there's no real easy way for you to control and manipulate that operating system to disable all this stuff. If we go a step further and talk about as far as the organization of the OS, if I enable this policy and I want to check every single one of these things, I have no option to do that. I literally have to click here and click on every single one of these things manually, one at a time. Now, we could script this. That is an option. We could go through PowerShell and script all this stuff to disable it. We could even export the XML file configuration to do so. However, most people that go through group policy settings to actually lock down their infrastructure are going to do it through the GUI. And as a result, when we go through the GUI, you're going to see that there are tons of these things that we have to go through and actually click to lock down the OS, which once again, without a click all, it takes more time. And if you're paying $150 to $300 an hour for a managed service provider IT person to lock down your infrastructure, and they have to not only go through this, but every single other group policy configuration to actually lock down the infrastructure, it's probably going to cost you close to 20 grand to do a build like this in order to lock down stuff on your system and your infrastructure that Microsoft, again, because of their laziness, shouldn't be there in the first place. You shouldn't have to pay for this. That's what I'm getting at, is it shouldn't be something that you have to pay for. It should be locked down out of the box, and then you should have to enable it. just like they used to do in the days of Windows XP, the days of Windows 2000, the days of Windows NT. In those OSs, everything was turned off by default, and you had to enable it if you wanted to use it. Now, everything is turned on by default, and you have to disable it if you want to secure the OS. Which, again, to me just sounds backwards and stupid. I would really like to know what you guys think. Leave a comment down below about that. Yet another really annoying thing about Microsoft Windows is Edge policy. Now, the reason why Edge policy is annoying is because I can understand why Edge policy would have existed when Edge was its own thing. But now that Edge is basically just Chromium, as is Chrome, why can't Edge use the same policy configuration as the Chromium policy? So in other words, why can't you create a centralized policy configuration for all Chromium-based applications and only do things once, rather than having to do things once for Chrome, once for Chromium, once for Edge, and Brave, Vivaldi, all of those things have their own policy set of templates, so ADMX templates for those specific applications. Why? Why can't we just have a centralized repository where we configure for Chromium-based applications where they all function the same, with the additional options from all the different browsers built in or baked into the same Chromium policies, so we don't have to do the same thing 15 times? Again, this is what I'm talking about with disorganization from Microsoft, because anybody that has any inkling of common sense would build things out this way, but they don't have any common sense. It's, like I said, a disaster. It's so disorganized there. I don't think they know half the time what they're doing. So I'm sure at this point you guys are wondering, well, why are we doing this? And the reason why is really actually pretty complicated. So if we talk about Windows 11, we're going to have to talk about the elephant in the room, which is that in about 2016 server, they removed the ability out of the box. So default out of the box configuration on Windows like 2008, 8R2, 12, 12R2, all had the enabled cache for group policy configuration. Now I can enable the cache. As a matter of fact, I created a policy specific to do that, which is group policy caching. And if I enable caching, what that gives me the ability to do is store the data in the C drive under Windows System 32, and then group policy, one word, is the folder. And in there, we're going to have a directory structure that's going to contain a cache of your group policy settings. Now, it's important to keep in mind that that exists because in the event that you ever want to revert or reset your group policy configuration on your Windows machine, you would have to go in there with command line and then QS the actual RMDIR, the actual directory's QS, to quietly and silently delete the data. And then you're going to have to also delete the INI file and the .gpt file out of there to get rid of the group policy template file and the INI, which is the configuration file. Now, once you do that, you could then go into the registry and change the cache mode setting to, I think it's 0, to basically null it. And at that point, the system won't read from the cache. It'll read from your updated group policy configuration location. Or you could go in here and you could change your group policy caching configuration settings to disabled. And if you do that, then what it'll do is it'll push the group policy to the machines, and all the machines will get the updated policy from the DC. The reason why you don't do that is because if you have users that are remote users that are on laptops from home, you want those users to be able to access the cache of group policy configurations. So that way, if they make any changes on their machine and they reboot the machine will automatically apply those cache changes back to the system, which is something I want to do for security for obvious reasons. Okay, so I'm going to let you guys in on a little secret. I kind of already know what works and what doesn't work because I've done this before. I've actually done this multiple times for clients to create security configuration policies defined specifically for people that didn't have domain controllers, and then implemented them on their client-based machines so that way they could have some level of security. So I already know what works and what doesn't. However, I did come across a Reddit forum on configuration of group policy, and I want to throw together a little thing of what doesn't work first before we get to the final product that actually does work. So I came across this article, and specifically what this article indicates is that he needs a copy of his domain group policy and import it as a local group policy on his client machines. So basically he's looking for a way to I guess, Google Chrome configuration. And then the answers are, are you getting rid of Active Directory? You want to copy the C Windows System 32 group policy and C Windows System 32 group policy users, and others maintaining permissions and file ownership, and yes, and yada yada. And then we could go in here and there's additional replies about how they did it with the LGGPO configuration. I say the magic word, education field free, blah, 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 so on and so forth. And somebody comes down here and says use the LGPO, which is local group policy object. It's the editor. And then we come down further and it gives more information on that stuff. But initially, one of the things here that got me was this, right? So it says copy the local group policy to the local group policy on our Windows system. So let's do that first and actually see what happens there. Okay, so what you guys can see on the screen now is the actual cache. Now I grabbed this off of a machine that's on the actual domain that we created with the group policy configurations. And I enabled cache mode through the group policy setting, as I shown earlier inside of the GPO configuration, the group policy management location. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to copy this data, and where we're going to have to copy it is we're going to have to go into File Explorer here, and we're going to go specifically to the System 32 location of group policy. We're going to see that it exists here, but we're going to highlight this and delete it because this is predates of the actual configuration that already existed. So let's go in here, grab this data. We'll do copy. We'll do copy. And we will paste it into the new location. Yes. Continue. Great. So now we have the group policy configuration in here. We have the INI. We have the data store, which contains the group policy, the sysvol for the actual domain with all the policies, as you can see here, in a policy configuration status. Now, what we're going to do now is go into command line. So we need CMD. We need to run this as admin. And we're going to do GP update force and hit enter. And this is going to run a group policy update based off of the cache configuration. So we notice that we have a completed successful. So at this point, we should be able to just reboot based on what we just read inside the Reddit. And once the system comes back up, we should have group policy. So let's reboot it now and take a look at that. Okay, so this machine just came back up. I didn't get prompted for my notification that I created at the beginning of the logon screen. So I could tell right away that the policy at least didn't work all the way through, if it worked at all. Now, because of the way the group policy works, when you use a cache policy in a workgroup machine, we should still see it inside of our group policy editor on the local machine. So if I do gp edit.msc, I should get the Microsoft Service Console. And if I just go in here and look specifically at even the most basic, right? So let's go to local accounts, security options. So no, because my administrator account isn't called Granite, my guest account isn't renamed to Karen, so I know that this policy did not apply. So this didn't work. However, I wonder if we could enable the configuration for group policy caching through the registry on the workgroup machine and force the machine at that point to use the cache. So initially, it indicates that in order to do this, we have to enable LUA, which unfortunately I tried to use an AI to actually give me that information, which God forbid, every time I use AI to look up IT information, the information I get back is wrong, outdated, or terrible. So that's not true. This is actually for the user access control stuff, which it doesn't make any sense why it wouldn't be enabled if UAC is enabled out of the box. So I mean, it's stupid that it's even there. So I think what I'm going to have to do, because I can't find anything on Google about that cache mode configuration, is I'm going to reset my domain Windows 11 machine back to the default, re-edit to the domain, but only apply the policy for the group policy configuration mode, and then use total compare to compare the two registry items, the default configuration and the configuration with the one change, and see if we could then pinpoint specifically what we need to change in the registry to enable the cache mode to pull the data directly back from that actual location. Now, if we were on Windows like 7, 8, 8.1, even 10, at least up to 21H2, this wouldn't even be a question. We could just do it through the same configuration that we have here because the cache mode would have been enabled out of the box on those systems. Once we get past 21H2, Windows 10 adds the implementation of not allowing cache mode by default. And if the domain controller doesn't have a defined domain policy, it doesn't change, which means that some machines on your infrastructure may have cache mode and some may not have cache mode. Now, with that said, enabling cache mode on a workgroup machine to pull back the policies directly from that folder doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to work, but I figure it's worth a shot. Hey, so I figure while I'm in here, I might as well just show you guys real quick. So this machine is now on the domain, as we could see. We ran a GP result, and we're going to look for computer settings. You're going to notice here that we see user settings, but as I scroll down in here, I don't see any computer settings. That doesn't mean the computer settings aren't applied. But what happens is there's something called mutual authentication. That's a requirement in Windows 10 version 15.11 and newer. I think it became a 100% mandate in 1803, but it might have been 1709. I can't remember off the top of my head. But what you need to do is you actually need to set up mutual authentication. So basically, the client machine will communicate to the domain controller back to the client machine. They'll do a mutual handshake to say that, yes, this machine is part of the domain and should trust the user. Because if not, you have to run the actual command lines as administrator to do another GP result, at which point then you could pull back computer settings. And that's only because I don't have mutual authentication turned on. Now, if I enable mutual authentication, that means that the user accounts on the system will get group policy. But if you don't have mutual authentication on and you don't have everybody as a local admin on your local machine, as you should, you'll never get group policy for the computer settings on the local desktop. So you want to make sure that you have the mutual authentication values configured. And if you don't know how to do that, check out the STIG. Again, I'll put all this stuff in the generic tech support website once I finish the video. So you should be able to go there and just figure out what I'm talking about as far as mutual authentication. But that's a requirement if you want your users to get computer policy on a domain machine that's built after probably 1709 would be the cutoff date on that. So anything that's newer likely has cached information, old data, or information that's not up to date or current. So the only reason I ran this is just to confirm that my group policy caching policy was actually applied, so I could see that it was. I had already taken a backup of the registry before I added this group policy configuration to the system. So now we should be able to use like Total Compare or Beyond Compare, whatever the heck that application's called, to do a comparison between two files, to take a look at the group policy settings, and to see what actually changed on our configuration, so we could see if we could resolve this on our work group machine. So unfortunately, that didn't really work. I actually have a huge amount of differences between both things. According to the actual bottom, the total count, I don't know if you could see it down here, but it says 92,300 differences. That's a lot for just one policy. So there's got to be something else that goes on in the back end that we don't know or we're not able to see when we add the group policy settings versus no group policy settings. So with that said, that's not going to work. So let's see if we can figure out what else we could do here to see specifically what takes place. You know, maybe if we just go to the SecEdit location, we'll be able to see it in there. Well, you know what? The SecEdit location shows a ton of stuff too, so it's not that. I'm wondering if maybe we should just clear the cache. So let's open up a command prompt. Run as administrator. Yes. Okay. So now we're going to do change directory to group policy. We'll clear it. We'll do a dir so you can see what's actually in there, and I'll explain what these are. So the data store is all of the actual policy configuration. That's your .pol files. It's going to also be all of your ADMX and ADML template configuration, basically a backup of your current policy as it sits, just in a GUID format. The GPTINI is the actual configuration that reads from the data store. And then the machine versus the user is the policy configurations themselves. So machine policy versus user policy. Now to clear the cache, it's really pretty easy. We'll just do rm dir, and we'll do data store, and we'll do q and s, and we'll hit enter. So that's gone. And we'll do delgpt.ini/f, that's gone. And then we'll do rmdir machine /q/s, gone. rmdir user /q/s, gone. Now if I do dir, we're empty. So at this point, I should be able to just do gp update force. But before I do that, let me go back in here so you could see. We're going to go into the registry one more time. So this is the sec edit values, right? So these are all the registry values that are currently enabled on this machine. Now, I don't know why they're here since this is a fresh machine. We just added it to the domain, and there's nothing in the policy control. So let's just GP update force this thing. And what that's going to do is it's going to download the updated policy configuration to the cache on the local machine. So once we do that, we should see the date and time change. So let's just do dir. There we go. We have data store. So it's 929. Now the rest of the stuff, the INI file, the machine and user, that's not going to populate until after we reboot the system because those are built on boot. They're not built on the configuration. Now, again, since this is just a cache, all it does is update the cache. It's still pulling the updated policy from the server. So I'm wondering if now, if we go in here and we do like refresh, if there will be less values in here. I'm guessing there's probably not, but we'll see. I don't see less values. All right, you know what? Because I'm curious what happens, let's right-click on this thing and do delete. Yes. And then let's create a new one, and let's add it as reg value. Okay, so I just added reg values as a key. As you can see, spelled exactly the same way, has the same space. Now at this point, I'm curious if we go in here and we do another GP update force, if it'll rebuild the reg value location in the sec edit policy. Presumably, it won't. I'm curious if we'll blue screen now after we reboot or if it'll just actually rebuild that reg value location. So let's give that a shot. Let's restart the system and see what happens. Okay, so we came back up without any issues. I don't see any error messages. I didn't get any pop-ups. Let's go into the reg edit and see if it rebuilt the sec edit values. It did not. So let's see. Last saved interval. Doesn't really tell me much. But so the thing is that's interesting is it didn't re-add those things. Now I'm curious if what happened is that we had the data inside of our cache, and when we added the system to the domain, it just pulled the cache information because the policy config said to read from the cache, which would be a proof of concept indicating that this is possible in workgroup mode to just add the cache value as long as you have the correct registry key. However, we still don't know what the correct registry key is. And because that may be the case, I may revert the snapshot back to the vanilla version and re-add it to the domain and see if that makes a difference just for the sake of time. Because as I've stated in the past with group policy, it's a switch. It's on and off. So the not configured only exists once. Once you change it to enabled, most of the time you have to change it to disabled. Unless it's a newer policy configuration, in which case then the default value is disabled if it's enabled. So in other words, if you turn it on and then you want to turn it off and you set it back to not configured, if it's the old version of the policy, it doesn't make any difference. It'll just remain on. If it's a new version of the policy, then it'll revert to whatever the default setting is. The problem is you really don't know from one to the next because in the policy definitions folder, it's written as far as the date is concerned on the installation time of the actual machine, not the creation date of the ADMX file. So you have no idea when that policy was created, so you don't know if it's a legacy or if it's current. So most of the time when you write a policy, if you want to revert it, you got to write the opposite. So if it's enabled, disable it, and so on and so forth. But let's reset this machine. We'll clear that cache. We'll re-add it to the domain and see if that makes any difference for our comparison. Okay, guys, so that made a huge difference. Let's check the checkbox and see the differences in the configuration. So it definitely was something that I did. As far as the configuration of adding the data into the policy definitions before adding the system to the domain seems to have read from the policy definitions cache before it pulled from the domain policy. So as a result, it wrote all of that crap to the registry, and we ended up with a huge amount of differences, which kind of shows you that that cache is very important when you are talking about re-adding a system to a domain. But at any rate, we're looking at 645 differences, which, while that's still a lot, it's not a ton. And I think that we could possibly use that by exporting just the differences from the compare tool to maybe a text file, and then using those configurations on the vanilla version of the system to add the registry keys back to the system to see if it's possible to read from the cache on the configuration. Now, you're going to ask why I'm doing this, and the truth is I'm just curious if it's possible to do it this way. Now, I know adding this stuff into the actual directory, the policy definitions, adding the policy definitions folder, and then adding the group policy into the group policy folder under the system32 location as a cache location without any configuration in workgroup mode does not work, period. However, I am curious if it would work if we figured out which registry keys were required in order to turn on cached mode in workgroup mode, if that's a possibility. And it's looking like it would be a possibility if we could figure out specifically what those registry keys are, which this kind of helps us. But if that doesn't work, then I could show you a different way to do this, which is scripting and using the LGPO tool to do it, which ultimately is probably the easier way to do it. But again, as a proof of concept, I figure you guys should troubleshoot with me, so here we are. Okay guys, so before I exported the data, I wanted to take a look specifically at what I would be exporting. And the thing is that while it is apparent where the actual policy configuration standards or sets take place, there's no way to do this and actually export the policy without including private data. So in other words, you couldn't create a workgroup machine for another company based off of this setting or the way to do it, just because your domain would automatically be associated with the configuration. There doesn't appear to be anything in this registry configuration that says, like an on and off switch to enable like the local configuration. So I see sync mode for slow threshold and stuff like that, but that's not really the answer that we're looking for. And the more I scroll through this, the more I realize that a lot of the comparison or changes between the two are just things that you would expect to be different, which is, like the encryption token from one logon to the next should be different. So I don't really see anything as far as that's concerned in here that I would say that's a configuration change we need to make in order to get the cached mode to work. Now, I was able to pull some of this data back into a WordPad or Notepad rather and take a look specifically at what the data contains, but you could see the OU structure. You could see a lot of stuff in here that I wouldn't want to share necessarily out to the real world if I was using an actual domain controller to build these for other workgroup machines. Now, if you own the workgroup machines and you own the domain controller, but you want to apply it, but you don't want to apply those machines to the domain for whatever reason, even though technically that's a violation of compliance, but if you don't have to go through compliance, that doesn't make any difference. You could go for it. It won't make any difference whatsoever, other than the fact that I think it would be a real pain in the neck to have to then dig back through the configuration and re-upload all of these settings on the cache in order for that to work. Now, what I will say does work is that if you have a remote user somewhere and you grab the cache off of a machine that's local to your infrastructure and you replace the cached information with the local infrastructure cache with the later update, that will apply the later updates to the remote employees so they don't have to be on the internal domain in order to get group policy updates. Now, that's super helpful if you have user policy, because user policy applies on authentication and not on system lock. So in other words, when the system's running, user policy will not apply. It only applies during authentication. And you end up in a cart and a horse situation because you're trying to apply user group policy configuration before you have an established VPN back to the infrastructure. And since you're not on the infrastructure, you won't get the user policy, which means that you could copy over that cache to that machine and then group policy update it without a connection to the domain controller and reboot the system, and it will apply that user policy to the local system. Okay guys, so I just went through every single line of code in here, and there's literally nothing that I could copy from one machine to the other that would allow us to apply the group policy as that other machine and not as expressly as the domain controller that applied it. So in other words, you can't just apply it by migrating those files over if you're not in the same domain cluster. You can move those files again from one machine to the other if the other machine is remote and it doesn't have any remote access into the internal infrastructure, but you want to upgrade the local policy on it. You could do it that way, but you can't do it in a workgroup mode. It's just not going to work correctly. So let's now jump into the LGPO configuration and take a look at how that's going to work. So we're on our Windows 11 machine now. Now this is a vanilla machine, meaning that there's literally nothing on it. We could go in here and we could go to CMD and we could just do a system info real quick. You'll be able to see that we don't have this machine on a domain. We are in workgroup mode, so it's Windows 11 Pro. Workgroup mode. Even the original desktop name is still in place. There's really no updates applied to it. It's pretty much what it would be when you did a fresh install. I'd also like to do a CMD again, but I think this time I need to do it as admin. Because again, I'm not running the mutual authentication stuff. So we just do GP result. We'll hit enter. And you'll see that we have no configuration really in here. It's pretty much what it would be out of the box. Nothing, nothing, nothing. No settings whatsoever. So now I'm going to walk you through how we're going to actually apply a group policy to this. Now, I say group policy, but I'm going to use group policy loosely. And the reason why is because the LGPO configuration tool works great in Windows 10, not so much in Windows 11. The problem with Windows 11 is that they changed a lot of configuration and they just haven't redone the tools yet to support the Windows 11 platform. So as a result, you know, you kind of half in and half out, which is much like most of Windows 11. Again, disaster. But I do want to show you how to do this. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to this PC, and for the sake of this and to tell you how to do it, you would have to follow exactly what I did as far as folder structure. So you would need a tools directory, a Granite 11 policy folder, and then all of the other stuff that's listed in here. So the folder structure would need to be identical in order for this to work correctly. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to edit the directory create. And if you go in here, you're going to see that it's going to tell you that it's got to create these directories. Now, you should have these directories created already because you're going to extract the actual package. But if you delete anything by accident, this tells you what the directory structure has to be. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to go in here, we're going to go to edit in here. I really don't like Notepad in Windows 11. And what we're going to do is we're going to X-copy all of the ADMX and all of the ADML files into the actual configuration. We're also going to copy the LGPO configuration, the executable, into System32. Now, the reason why we're going to do this is because in order for us to run the policy update, the policy definitions would need to exist in our Windows 11 system. Now, while Windows 11 24H2 contains a lot of policy, it doesn't contain all of the policy that would have been in the configuration for our NIST standards, which is something that also exists in our Granite build for XP. Then we get to step 3. I'm just going to right-click on this thing and go to Edit Notepad. And we're going to see that we're going to use the LGPO with a -B to export the internal group policy configuration. Now, just because we're in workgroup mode doesn't mean that there's not a group policy configuration in workgroup mode. There is, the default one. And there's only one that exists in workgroup mode. When you add a system to a domain, you could have 50, 60, 70, 1,000. It doesn't make any difference the amount of policies you apply to a system. It's because it reads it from the group policy configuration in the cache. Whereas when we're doing it this way, we're going to create the registry poll file, and that poll file is going to contain the group policy configuration. Now I'm going to say contain, and I'm going to say it loosely. And the reason why I'm going to say it loosely is because it doesn't work 100%. It's not going to support everything you can do on a domain controller, but it will add additional security to your system. To be honest, this is probably a lot better for somebody that just wants to, maybe control Google Chrome or Firefox and not a full suite of packages and a configuration. But at any rate, we're going to run that. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to look at the README because it's important, which is basically we have to modify the step 5. If not, this will not work. So if we go into step 5 and we right-click and we do edit in here, we're going to see a script that's going to allow, I'm going to expand this a little bit so I can get the full screen, assuming that this thing will actually, there we go. So this is going to parse the local configuration. Now, the GUID, which is configured for your local policy, is different every single time you run it. So as a result, I can't tell you what it'll be on your machine. You'll have to figure it out on your own. And I'm going to show you how to do that in a second, but you're still going to have to do it on your own. I can't tell you what that is. At that point, we're going to take that registry poll file and we're going to convert it to a text document, and then take the text document and change it again back to a poll file, and then take the poll file and import the poll file into the actual system itself to redo the local configuration on the system. We're going to take a backup of the changes that we just made, and then we're going to reboot the system. So let's start this process, and we'll take a look at how this looks and how this works. Also, what it does and what it does not do. Okay, so we already have the directory structure because it exists up here. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to right-click on this thing, and we're going to do Run as Administrator. And that's going to import all of our ADMX and ADML files. And we're going to go to number 3, and we're going to Run as Administrator. And this is going to create our local group policy configuration, which we can now see here. And if we drill into this, you'll see the group policy for machine and user, much like you would see in the cache that we looked at previous. So let's drop back, drop back, drop back. We're going to need to grab this actual name structure. And then we're going to go up a level, and we're going to go into number 5. And we're going to choose to edit Notepad. And we're going to replace this entire thing with what we just copied. Now you're going to keep in mind that there's no spaces between here and there's no spaces between here. It's a solid line of command. So now that we have that added, we're going to actually save this. And then we're going to have to change the data that's in that directory. So if we go into policy objects and into GPO, we're going to see machine and user. So we're actually just going to right click and do another folder here. And then go back into tools and into the Granite policy and into the LDO and into the local. And we're into here and we're into sysvol and we're into GPO. And we're going to highlight this and shift delete it. And then we're going to come over here into our policy objects, and we're going to grab both the user and the machine, and we're going to copy it, and we're going to paste it into this location. All right, so now we could close out of those things, and actually we should go back in because we do need to run our executable, or our batch file rather. So we're going to go back into Tools, into Granite, and at this point we should be able to right-click and Run as Administrator, and yes. And then this is going to give us 9 seconds before it auto-reboots the system. And when the system comes back up, we'll take a look at what's been applied to the system. So at first look, it doesn't look like anything actually applies. And the reason why I say that is because we didn't get to pop up the notification that the system's protected by yada, yada, yada. That didn't occur here. However, if we go into the Start menu and we go into CMD, we run this as administrator. We say yes. And we do GP result /Z and we hit enter. Now you're going to see all of the group policy data actually applied to this system. So if we scroll back up here, you'll see everything that's been applied. So we see that user policy filtering not applied, unknown reason. We don't see anything in here. We don't see any configuration denieds in here. But if we scroll up and we continue to scroll, we'll see all the group policy configuration that did apply. So like the Defender scan settings, we have Google Chrome settings, we have Adobe settings, we have Terminal Server settings, we have Firefox settings, we have Internet Explorer settings. And if we keep going and going and going and going, you'll continue to see all of the policy configuration that has gone into this actual system. So I'm just going to grab this and slide it up slowly so we could try to make out some of it, but not all of it, because it's not necessary. We know that there's policy configured in here. Just keep going and going and going and going and going. Probably going to run out of buffer. No, maybe not. So if I go down here, we're going to see applied group policy objects, local group policy. Now the reason why we see local group policy is because we're not applying group policy from a domain controller. This is the local group policy configuration that we applied, which is all the administrative template settings that exist in here that we can see. Now we'll notice that we have Mozilla Firefox configurations in here as well. And the reason why we could see those is because we imported the ADMX and ADML templates into the actual system. The thing is that while we do have local group policy configured, and we do have a whole bunch of settings configured, we don't have all the settings. Now, the reason why we don't have all the settings is because we don't have the sec edit configuration added to the system. We just have the poll added to the system. So at this point, this is where I would stop the video, usually, and say that we've completed the policy configuration for our poll import. But I'm going to venture into the unknown. And the unknown is, can we import the configuration from the sec edit from a Windows 11 machine that has the group policy configurations already applied that are in this policy? to this machine? Could we add those policy configurations in this machine? And further, since we have the configurations in our machine and user config for our administrative templates for our group policy object caching, could we just add the cache and apply those policies? I think now is a good place to take a snapshot on the system, and let's try it out. Okay, guys, so I should probably change the desktop background, because what I did is I ended up building another machine, snapshotting that machine, so that way we have a backup of the machine that's the vanilla version that has no domain access, and then we also have a domain version of a machine. So this machine is a domain version, and if we jump into our configuration here, we should be able to go into Windows System 32, Group Policy. And interestingly, we don't have a cache. So that's bizarre because we do have caching enabled on the actual group policy configuration. So we should have one. I'm wondering if we go into CMD here and we do a GP update force, if we'll get anything of that, if there will be any errors or any configuration problems or anything like that. Interesting. So perhaps one of the interesting things about this is the fact that it appears that at least DNS is functioning correctly. So it doesn't look like there's an issue with DNS. I wonder if it's because of the name. Maybe I should rename the machine, re-add the machine, and see what happens. All right. Well, that was a giant fiasco. And here we are. So we're back on our vanilla version of Windows 11. I couldn't get that stupid thing to work, the new machine I built, and then I ended up building another one and it worked fine to extract the policies. So clearly there was just something wrong with the build. I don't know why, because it's literally the exact same ISO file that I used to build the second machine as well as this machine, and all three of those machines, or all those other machines, work fine. So there was just something funky with that configuration on that particular system, which again is about on par for consistency with Windows operating systems. But what I did is I actually created a group policy object, so the machine and user configuration, directly from the domain join machine using the LGPO export, using itemized policy versus a single policy set. I also included the group policy configuration for cached mode, and then I grabbed specifically the cached configuration for the domain policy themselves that I could add into the local policy config to see if that adds the ability to have additional group policy settings. So let's start this over now at this point, and let's rerun our configuration and see if we have more policy, less policy. And if we have the same policy, it's all good, because what we'll do is we'll literally just jump back into the config, we'll add the stuff into the cache location and reboot, and see if that helps to bring the rest of the policy into our Windows 11 machine. Okay, so as usual, let's just extract, so we'll run as admin. Great. We're going to create our local policy, so I just want to go in here real quick and just double check to make sure I don't have anything listed under local, and I don't. So let's create our local policy. Perfect. Now I'm going to have to modify this script again, so we're going to have to go in here and do edit notepad. We're going to see your modification here. So let's go back up a level. Let's go into the LGPO. Let's go in here and let's just grab this, right click, copy. We'll go back in here. I'm going to paste this into this location. There we go. Okay, so that's done. So now I'm just going to save this. And I'm going to close this. And I'm going to open this and open the GPO location. I'm going to let that hang out there for a second. And then open up another window here into Tools, into the Granite package itself, back into Policy Objects, back into GPO. And I'm going to grab these two group policy objects. And we can just delete this. Right click and paste. All right, perfect. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go back into our Granite package and we're going to run number 5 as admin. Great, so that runs the backup, and now in 9 seconds it'll reboot, and we can check again to see if now we have more policy or less. All right, so the system came back up, and it's much like it was before. So if we go in here and we do CMD, and we do GP result Z, I forgot we're not running this as admin, and I don't have the configuration in place. So let's just open up command prompt again. One of these days, this thing will just work correctly. I hate the fact that it doesn't. And now we're in terminal, and I got to go back to CMD. Let's do clear CLS. We're not in Linux. Now let's do GP result Z and see what we get for a result. So it's much of the same thing. We get a ton of configuration added in here, and if we scroll up, we can go through all the configuration standards and settings. I don't see, and again, once again, we're looking at local group policy configuration. So I don't know if it'll work, but let's try it now. Let's add the policy configuration into our local set. Let's do another GP update. We'll reboot the system and see if we then get the additional policy configuration that seems to be missing here. Okay, so this probably won't be super riveting, but we can go in here. We got group policy. And now we're going to go back in here again. And we're going to go C:\Windows /system32. And then group policy. So there we go. Now we got group policy in here. We do see that we're missing data in here, but you know, again, this is created through a script, so I suspect that we'll miss data, but I'm going to just shift delete the group policy that currently exists in here. I'm going to do this for everything. I'm going to go over here and I'm going to grab the policy that I had that as a backup from the other machine and paste it in here. And say OK. And now I'm curious if we'll notice any difference whatsoever. So we're going to actually do CMD. We'll run it as administrator. Yes. And we'll do GP update. Force. Let's see if this makes any difference whatsoever. Chances are we're going to have to reboot to actually see or tell if it makes any difference, but we're going to do a GP update force. And then once this is done, now what we're going to do is we're going to reboot the system and see, did it make any difference at all? So, unfortunately, I don't think it made any difference because I was actually able to just log right into the system. Now, in the Granite configuration on the domain, we get a pop-up notification that the system's been secured by yada, yada, yada. But we're not getting that here. So we're clearly missing one additional step. Now, this video is probably super long to begin with, so I'm going to end it here. But there will be a part 2 to this where we continue on the troubleshooting process to try to get group policy to apply to a local system on Windows 11. Now, keep in mind, this was super easy on Windows 10, but on Windows 11, once again, it's a disaster. It's not well organized, and it's a catastrophic pile of garbage when it comes to actual operating system because none of it works correctly. It's not just like little things that you see, right? So you click on something, it doesn't work right, it doesn't bring up a menu, but the back-end kernel configuration of it is such a disorganized disaster that even that doesn't work right. And you could say, well, it was never designed to do this, and you'd be right. It was never designed to do this. But if that's the case, why do they make an offline tool to do it called the lgpo.exe file, which is literally designed for local group policy object configuration? So it tells me right away that they just don't know what they're doing and that the configuration, as far as I'm concerned, it's just a mess. Who knows? Maybe by 29H2 it'll be finally fixed when we get the Windows 12 release the next year. But right now, it's still a mess. I would still run Windows 10 over this, and I don't even care that Windows 10 goes at end of life and doesn't get policy or doesn't get updates. I would literally just secure the Windows 10 machine and run that over running this, just because, again, this is just an absolute mess. Anyway, thanks for sticking around through the whole troubleshooting fun and process of this. I will throw together an article inside of the Generic Tech Support website once I have this done with all the step-by-step procedure and configuration. But right now it's kind of half in, and I don't want to give half in information. So thanks again for watching. Take it easy, guys. Thank you for watching the Generic Tech Support YouTube channel. Find the content of this video at https://generictechsupport.com/channel.